You're being removed. Now. The sentence cracked through Terminal B like a dropped glass, sharp enough to turn heads from Gate 19 all the way to the coffee stand where a man froze mid-sip, watching as two uniformed officers stepped in close to Darius Cole, their posture firm, their tone rehearsed, as if this moment had already been decided before he even spoke, and yet Darius didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even blink. He simply stood there in a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers that looked like they'd walked more boardrooms than sidewalks, his hands relaxed at his sides, his gaze steady, like a man who had seen this exact scene before, just with different faces and a different ceiling. The hum of rolling suitcases and boarding calls fading into something tighter, something charged, because people were watching now, phones slowly lifting, whispers threading through the air. What did he do? Is this real? But 10 minutes earlier none of them had noticed him. Not when he stepped into the priority line with a single carry-on. Not when he placed his ID and boarding pass on the counter with quiet precision. Not even when the agent looked at him, then looked again, like something didn't add up, her voice dipping just enough to sting. You sure you're in the right line? And that was the moment it started, not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in tone, a pause that lingered too long, a second glance that said more than words ever could. And Darius had seen that look before, years ago, different airport, same question, same doubt dressed up as policy, back when he was 25 and told to step aside while others walked through without a glance. Back when he learned that sometimes the system didn't need to shout to push you out. It just needed to hesitate, to question, to delay, and now here it was again. Just dressed in newer uniforms and cleaner floors, the agent calling over a supervisor, the supervisor calling over security, each step escalating with that same quiet certainty that he didn't belong. And still Darius didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself, because this wasn't new to him. This was pattern, and patterns were predictable. And predictable meant controllable. And as one officer reached gently but firmly for his arm, guiding him away from the counter and into the open space of the terminal, where everyone could see, Darius finally moved, not resisting, just walking, measured, deliberate, like he was letting something unfold exactly the way it was supposed to. His eyes scanning the room once, taking in every witness, every raised phone, every uncertain face, before reaching into his pocket, pulling out his phone, and speaking just loud enough to cut through the noise. Activate internal audit. Live. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius Cole. The officer tightened his grip slightly, misunderstanding the calm for compliance, the silence for surrender. But Darius stopped walking, just for a second, enough to turn his head, enough for his voice to land clear and controlled. You might want to check who you're escorting out. And somewhere behind the counter, a screen flickered. The screen behind the counter did not just flicker once, it pulsed like it was trying to catch up with something it was not prepared for. A soft chime cut through the terminal noise, then another, then a rapid sequence of alerts stacking on top of each other, and the agent who had questioned him seconds ago froze mid-motion, her hand still hovering over the keyboard, her eyes narrowing not in suspicion this time, but confusion, because the system was no longer responding the way she expected it to. And that was the first crack, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to shift the air from control to uncertainty. The supervisor standing beside her leaned and tapping the screen, once then twice harder this time, as if pressure could fix what was happening, but the display only refreshed into something heavier, a banner appearing across the top of the interface, internal audit in progress, restricted access enabled, and that was when the tone of the room changed, not the volume, not yet, but the weight of it. The officers escorting Darius slowed their steps without realizing it, their grip loosening just enough to suggest hesitation, because behind them the rhythm of the terminal had broken. The boarding announcements still echoed overhead, but no one was listening anymore. Every set of eyes had redirected toward the unfolding moment, and Darius felt it, all of it, the shift, the pause, the quiet recalculation, happening in real time, and still he said nothing, his face calm, his posture unchanged, like a man standing exactly where he intended to be all along. 10 years earlier, he had stood in another terminal, smaller, older, less polished, holding a boarding pass that was also questioned back. Then he explained himself back. Then he tried to prove something back, Then he thought clarity would fix doubt, but it did not. It only invited more questions, more delays, more quiet dismissals. And that was the day he learned something that stayed with him longer than any flight ever could. Systems do not fail because they are broken. They fail because they are followed without thinking. And now, as he stood here again in a different city with different uniforms and the same pattern repeating, he did not explain. He let the system speak for itself. The supervisor stepped back slightly, her voice lower, now no longer sharp, but edged with something she could not hide. "What is your name?" she asked, as if the answer might undo what was happening. But Darius did not look at her right away. His eyes moved instead to the officer beside him, then to the growing circle of witnesses, then back to the counter where another alert appeared, and another, each one tightening the invisible net around the moment. He finally answered, but not with urgency, not with pride, just with certainty. "Darius Cole." And the name did not land like a shout. It landed like a key turning somewhere deep in the system, because the agent's screen refreshed again, this time pulling up a profile that did not match the assumptions that had been made just minutes earlier. Priority clearance, executive override, board level access, and suddenly the silence was no longer empty. It was heavy enough to feel. The word executive did not echo, but it settled heavy across the counter like something that could not be ignored, and the agent's fingers slowly pulled back from the keyboard, as if even touching the system now felt like a mistake. The supervisor leaned closer, her eyes scanning the screen again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if hoping it would change back into something familiar, something safe. But it did not. The profile remained, expanded lines of authority stacking beneath his name, access tiers that did not belong to someone, being escorted out, and for the first time since this started, no one spoke, not the agent, not the supervisor, not the officers beside him, because the certainty that had driven every decision just minutes ago had quietly dissolved into doubt, and doubt in a place built on procedure was dangerous. One of the officers shifted his stance, loosening his hold completely, now stepping half a pace back, not an apology, not yet, but an instinct, like the room itself was recalibrating around a new center, and Darius felt it, the pivot, the subtle retreat, the way authority began to pull inward when it realized it had overstepped. But he did not move to reclaim space. He did not step forward. He simply remained where he was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, letting the silence stretch long enough for everyone to feel it, because silence, when it is earned, carries more weight than any explanation ever could. The supervisor finally spoke, her voice lower, now stripped of the sharp edge it carried before. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," she said, but even as she said it, her eyes never left the screen, because the system was still updating, more alerts appearing, compliance flagged, incident review initiated, live audit active, and each new line made the situation harder to explain away. A young employee, standing 2 stations over, leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a better look at the screen, her expression shifting from curiosity to realization. In seconds, she had seen that name before, not in person, but in internal briefings and training slides, in emails marked high priority, and she whispered it almost to herself, "Cole," and that whisper traveled further than it should have, because the supervisor heard it, and so did the agent, and so did a man standing in line behind the rope barrier, who had been watching since the beginning, his phone still raised, recording everything. He leaned toward the person next to him and said, "I think that is him. I have seen that name somewhere." And just like that, the moment that had started as quiet removal began to turn into something else entirely, recognition, the kind that spreads faster than any announcement, the kind that does not need confirmation, because it builds on memory, on fragments, on pieces clicking together in real time. And Darius watched it unfold without interruption, because this part mattered more than anything, not the reveal itself, but what came before it, the behavior, the assumptions, the choices made when no one thought they were being seen, because now they were all being seen, every word, every glance, every decision. And the supervisor took a small step back from the counter, her posture no longer squared, her confidence no longer anchored. She looked at Darius directly for the first time, not past him, not through him, but at him. And the question she asked was not procedural anymore. It was personal. "Why did you not say anything earlier?" And Darius held her gaze for a brief moment before answering, his voice calm, measured, untouched by the tension around him. "Because I wanted to see how far you would go." The question did not land softly. It settled into the space like a weight no one knew how to lift, because there was no good answer, not one that could undo what had already happened, not One that could rewind the past 10 minutes and replace every look, every word, every decision with something better. The supervisor opened her mouth slightly, as if to respond, but nothing came out, because the truth was already visible, not in what she would say, but in what she had already done. And behind her the system continued to update, lines of data stacking in real-time, timestamps locking in each action, each escalation, each ignored opportunity to stop and reassess. And now the terminal was no longer just a place of travel. It felt like a live record of everything that had unfolded, a quiet audit unfolding in front of strangers who had become witnesses without asking to be one of the officers. Glanced toward the counter, then back at Darius, his posture no longer firm but uncertain, as if he was waiting for new instructions that had not yet arrived, because the authority he had followed minutes ago was now being questioned by the very system that defined it. And that hesitation spread quickly. The second officer shifted his stance, stepping fully back, now creating space between himself and Darius, not out of fear, but out of realization that this moment no longer belonged to them. The agent behind the counter swallowed hard, her eyes still locked on the screen, as more internal notifications appeared. Compliance review escalated, executive oversight engaged, regional director notified, each line carrying more weight than the last. And somewhere in the terminal a phone rang sharply, then another one at a different station, then a third, and suddenly the quiet system alerts had turned into something louder, something harder to contain. Because this was no longer local, this was moving upward. Fast. The young employee who had whispered his name earlier stepped forward slightly, her voice careful but clear. "I have seen your name in the leadership briefings," she said, and the words did not sound like praise. They sounded like confirmation, like the final piece of something falling into place. And the man with the phone in the line took a step closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep it private. "That is him. I am telling you, that is him." And the ripple of recognition moved through the small crowd, faster now, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, because people were connecting the moment to something bigger than what they had first assumed. And Darius remained still in the center of it all, not stepping forward, not reclaiming control, just allowing the truth to settle into the room on its own terms. Because power, when it is real, does not rush to announce itself. It waits for everything else to fall away. And the supervisor finally straightened slightly, her composure trying to rebuild around what remained of her authority, her voice steadier now, but still carrying the strain of someone realizing the ground beneath her had shifted. "We were following procedure," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, they sounded thinner than before, because procedure without judgment had brought them here. And Darius tilted his head just slightly, not dismissive, not aggressive, just enough to hold her attention as he answered, his voice calm but sharper now. "Because procedure is not the problem," he said quietly, "it is how you choose to use it." And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because that was the part no system could hide. The words lingered longer than expected, not because they were loud, but because they could not be argued with. And the supervisor felt it, the shift from control to exposure, the kind that does not come from being corrected, but from being seen clearly and completely. For the first time, she glanced back at the screen again, as if hoping for something to interrupt the moment, something to redirect the attention building around them. But the system only continued to document quietly, methodically, each second adding more weight to what had already been done. And somewhere behind the counter, a senior terminal phone rang again, sharper this time, more urgent, and the agent hesitated before answering, her hand hovering just above the receiver, because whatever was on the other end of that call was no longer routine, and she knew it the second she picked up. Her voice dropped lower, more formal. "Yes, this is Gate 23, she said, listening carefully, her expression tightening with each passing second until she finally responded, "Yes, he is still here." And that was when the supervisor turned fully toward Darius, not with authority, not with confidence, but with the realization that this moment had moved beyond her reach. The young employee, who had stepped forward earlier, remained still, her eyes moving between Darius and the screen, as if trying to understand how something so subtle had escalated into something this large so quickly. And she whispered, almost under her breath, "We should have just checked." And those words, though quiet, carried further than expected, because they were simple, honest, and impossible to ignore. A man in the crowd lowered his phone slightly, shaking his head, not in disbelief, but in recognition, like he had seen something like this before somewhere else with someone else. And that realization settled into the space just as heavily as everything else, because this was no longer about one moment, It was about a pattern repeating in real time, and Darius stood in the center of it all, still composed, still measured, his presence steady, like an anchor in a room that had begun to drift, and for a brief second his gaze softened, not toward the supervisor, not toward the officers, but toward the young employee who had spoken because she had said the one thing no one else had admitted. They had not verified, they had assumed, and assumptions once acted upon could not be undone, they could only be revealed. And from the far end of the counter another figure approached quickly, a man in a navy suit, badge clipped at his waist, his pace controlled, but urgent, the kind of urgency that does not rush, but does not waste a single step, either the regional operations manager, and the moment he stepped into view the energy shifted again, quieter this time, but more focused, because this was not escalation, this was intervention. He stopped a few feet from Darius's eyes, scanning the scene, the officers, the supervisor, the open system display, the gathered crowd, and then finally resting on Darius himself. And in that brief pause, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, not of a face, but of a situation that had already gone too far. The manager exhaled slowly, then spoke, his voice calm, but firm. What exactly happened here? And no one answered right away, not because they did not want to, but because there was no version of the story left that could hide what everyone had already seen. And Darius did not rush to fill the silence. He simply looked at the manager for a moment, then said quietly, "I gave them every chance to get it right." The manager did not respond immediately. He held Darius's gaze for a second longer than expected, as if measuring not the words but the weight behind them. And then he turned slowly toward the supervisor, his expression neutral but sharpened by understanding, the kind that comes from having seen situations like this before, just not this exposed, not this undeniable. "What steps were taken?" he asked, his tone controlled but precise, and the supervisor straightened instinctively, her voice trying to recover its earlier firmness. "We followed protocol, we identified a discrepancy and escalated appropriately." But even as she spoke, her eyes flickered toward the screen behind her, where the audit log continued to populate line after line, documenting each action in exact sequence timestamps, leaving no space for interpretation. And the manager glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "A discrepancy," he repeated, and this time there was a pause, not because he was unsure, but because he already knew the answer before the supervisor could respond. The young employee spoke again, her voice quieter, but steadier now. "There was no discrepancy," she said. "We did not verify the boarding pass, we assumed." And the word assumed landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it was simple and impossible to reframe. The supervisor turned sharply toward her, but stopped short of interrupting, because the moment for control had passed, and everyone knew it. The manager nodded once slowly, then stepped closer to the counter, his attention shifting fully to the system display. He scrolled through the audit log, his finger moving down the screen, reading each entry in silence. "Request for verification denied, escalation to supervisor, security notified before identity confirmation." And with each line the room seemed to tighten, not with noise, but with clarity, the kind that leaves no room for explanation. He exhaled quietly, then turned back toward the officers. "You were instructed to escort him out before confirmation?" he asked, and one of the officers nodded once, his voice low. "We followed the supervisor's direction." And there was no defensiveness in it, just fact, because that was all that remained now, facts and consequences. The manager shifted his attention back to Darius, his posture changing subtly, not submissive, not deferential, but aligned, like someone who understood exactly where authority now stood. "Mr. Cole," he said, his tone respectful without exaggeration, "I need to understand if there is anything further that occurred." And Darius held his gaze for a moment before answering, no raised voice, no tension, just clarity. "Nothing beyond what you have already seen," he said. "They made a decision before they had information, and then they followed it all the way through." And the manager nodded again, slower this time, because that was the part that mattered, not the initial doubt, but the commitment to it, the refusal to pause, to question, to correct. And behind them another alert sounded louder than the rest, a confirmation notification, corporate oversight, engaged, real-time review locked. And for a brief second even the ambient noise of the terminal seemed to fall away, because this was no longer internal, this was visible, beyond this space, beyond this moment. And the supervisor's shoulders dropped slightly, the realization settling in not as panic, but as something heavier, something final. And Darius remained still at the center of it all, not claiming control, not demanding resolution, just present, steady and unshaken, because the system was already doing what he had come here to see it reveal everything. The confirmation alert did not fade, it stayed pinned at the top of the system like a line that could not be erased. Corporate oversight engaged, real-time review locked, and the weight of those words settled across the counter heavier than anything that had been said out loud. Because this was no longer a moment that could be managed locally. This had moved beyond the terminal, beyond the supervisor, beyond even the manager, now standing there trying to contain what could not be contained. He glanced once more at the screen, then reached for his own phone. Stepping slightly aside as he answered a call that had clearly been waiting, his voice lowered but still audible enough for those closest to catch fragments. "Yes, I see it now. Yes, he is here. Understood. I will handle it." And when he ended the call, he did not rush back into control. He walked back with measured steps, stopping directly in front of Darius, his posture now fully aligned with the reality of the situation, not the version that had existed 10 minutes ago. "Mr. Cole," he said again, this time more deliberate, "I want to acknowledge what has happened here before anything else is said." And the words were careful, not rehearsed, but chosen, because the room no longer allowed for anything careless. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably beside him, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier with every passing second. The officers stood back completely, now no longer participants, just witnesses to a moment that had moved past them, and the crowd had grown slightly, not chaotic, not loud, but present enough that every movement, every word carried further than intended. A woman near the rope barrier lowered her phone slowly, her expression no longer curious, but firm, like she was watching something she understood on a deeper level, and a man beside her nodded once under his breath. "This is exactly how it happens," and the sentence lingered because it did not accuse anyone directly. It did not need to. The pattern had already been revealed, and Darius stood steady, his gaze fixed on the manager, not confrontational, not distant, just present, the way someone stands when they know the outcome is already unfolding. And the manager continued, his voice steady but edged with responsibility. "There will be an immediate review of every action taken here, every decision, every escalation, and the system has already begun that process." He paused briefly, then added more quietly, "But clearly what concerns me is not that a mistake was made, it is how quickly it was repeated." And that was the fracture point, because mistakes can be explained, but patterns expose something deeper. The supervisor finally spoke, her voice restrained but strained. "We were trying to protect the integrity of the process, but even..." As she said it, the words felt disconnected from the reality now visible in front of everyone, and Darius answered before the manager could respond, his tone calm but firm. "Integrity does not come from questioning someone, it comes from how you treat them while you do." And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of recognition, the kind that shifts a room without raising a voice. And somewhere behind the counter, another system alert appeared: access privileges under review. And for the first time since this began, the supervisor looked not at Darius, not at the manager, but at the screen, as if realizing that the system she trusted to support her decisions was now examining them instead. And Darius did not move, did not speak again, because the moment had already reached the point where nothing more needed to be said. The truth was no longer being argued, it was being processed in real time. For a brief second, nothing moved, not the manager, not the supervisor, not even the crowd, because the system had taken over the moment. And when systems move at that level, they do not rush, they finalize. And Darius stood there in the center of it all, feeling something familiar, not the tension, not the attention, but the stillness that comes right before everything changes. And it pulled him back, not physically, but mentally. Years earlier, different airport, different uniform, same pause. He had been younger, then standing in line with a ticket. He had saved weeks to afford, watching as others moved forward while he was asked to step aside again. And again, no explanation, just delay. Dressed as procedure, he remembered the fluorescent lights, the quiet stares, the way the agent avoided eye contact while pretending to follow rules, and how he stood there trying to stay composed, trying to understand what he had done wrong, until he realized it was never about what he had done, it was about what they decided he was before he even spoke. And that moment stayed with him, not as anger, but as clarity, the kind that reshapes how you move through the world. Because from that day forward, he stopped explaining himself to systems that were not ready to listen. He built his own systems instead, systems that did not hesitate based on appearance, systems that required verification before judgment, systems that documented every decision so nothing could hide behind uncertainty. And now, standing here again, watching the same pattern unfold with newer technology, but the same instinct beneath it, he did not feel surprised, he felt resolved, because this was not just a moment, it was confirmation that the work was not finished. The manager's voice broke through the silence, pulling him back to the present. Mr. Cole, we have just received confirmation from corporate. The review has been escalated to executive-level oversight effective immediately, and the words carried weight not because they were loud, but because of what they meant. This was no longer being handled as an incident, it was being examined as a standard, and the supervisor's breath caught slightly, not dramatic, just enough to reveal the pressure building beneath her composed exterior, because executive-level oversight does not review moments, it reviews patterns, and patterns lead to outcomes that cannot be softened. The young employee took a small step back, her eyes moving between the screen and Darius, as if she was witnessing something she would not forget, something that would follow her long after this shift ended, and the crowd remained quiet, still present, still watching, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of understanding, because what they were seeing was not an argument, it was accountability unfolding without interruption. And Darius inhaled slowly, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, not with emotion, but with purpose, because this was the moment he had waited for, not the reveal, not the recognition, but the point where the system could no longer ignore what it had just done. And the manager looked at him again, this time more direct, more grounded. We are going to correct this immediately, he said, but Darius did not respond right away. He let the words sit in the air for a second before answering, his voice steady, calm, but unmistakably firm. Correction is not the same as accountability, and once again the room shifted, not because of volume, but because of truth. The words did not fade, they stayed suspended in the air like something the room could not move past, because everyone understood the difference now. Correction fixes a moment, accountability exposes a pattern, and the manager felt it immediately, the weight of that distinction settling into his posture as he nodded, once not in agreement alone, but in recognition that this was no longer about resolving a situation, it was about addressing something deeper, something that had already been recorded and could not be undone. He glanced toward the screen again, where the audit log had expanded further, now highlighting segments in red markers, identifying points of escalation where alternative actions could have been taken, but were not, each line precise, each timestamp exact, and together they told a story more clearly than anyone in the room could explain. The supervisor followed his gaze, her expression tightening as she read the same lines, realizing that the system was not just documenting actions, it was evaluating them. And for the first time since this began, her silence was no longer defensive, it was heavy with understanding. The young employee shifted slightly beside the counter, her hands clasped together as if holding onto something steady, because what she was witnessing was not just a mistake being addressed, it was a structure being examined, and that realization carried its own kind of gravity. The manager stepped closer to the counter, his voice lower now, but more deliberate. We are initiating a full behavioral review effective immediately, he said. Every interaction at this terminal will be audited against compliance standards and training protocols, and the phrasing was careful, but the meaning was clear. This would not stop here, the ripple would extend beyond this moment, beyond this team, beyond this shift. And the officers standing nearby exchanged a brief glance, not out of fear, but awareness that what had happened in front of them was now part of something larger, something that would define more than just this incident. The crowd remained still, phones lowered now, not because the moment had lost its intensity, but because it had transformed into something quieter, something more final. A woman near the barrier folded her arms slowly, her eyes fixed on the counter, not in anger, but in reflection, as if she had just watched something she already knew confirmed in real time. And Darius stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, steady, composed, his presence unchanged, because this was never about reacting, it was about revealing. And the manager turned back to him, his tone measured but sincere. Mr. Cole, I understand your point, and you are right, accountability must follow this. And there was a pause, not empty, but intentional, as he chose his next words carefully. This will not be resolved with an apology alone. And Darius met his gaze calmly, then answered without hesitation, it was never about an apology, and that was the moment everything settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, because what had unfolded here was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision made without verification, a pattern repeated without reflection, and now exposed without defense. And behind them the system issued one final alert, in a steady tone, escalation complete, review locked, actions pending, and no one needed to ask what that meant, because the outcome was already in motion. and for the first time since this began, no one in the room was trying to control what happened next. They were waiting for it. The final alert did not sound urgent. It sounded settled, like a door closing somewhere deep in the system, and for a moment no one moved, because the meaning of it was clear even without explanation. Actions pending did not suggest possibility, it suggested inevitability, and the manager felt that more than anyone, his posture straightening slightly, not to regain control, but to align with what was already in motion. He reached for the terminal console beside him, entering a secure authorization code with deliberate precision, his fingers steady as the interface shifted again, unlocking a restricted panel that had not been visible before, and the supervisor watched it happen, her expression tightening as she realized she was no longer part of the decision-making layer. She was now inside the review itself. The young employee stepped back another inch, instinctively creating distance from the counter, as if the space had changed function entirely from service to accountability, and the manager spoke again, his voice calm, but now carrying a finality that had not been there before. Effective immediately, all access for this terminal is being temporarily reassigned pending outcome of executive review, and the words were not loud, but they carried across the small crowd with unmistakable clarity. The agent behind the counter blinked once, her screen dimming slightly as her permissions shifted in real-time. Controls she had used minutes ago now restricted functions locked behind new authorization levels, and she pulled her hands back slowly, as if the system itself had drawn a line she could not cross. The supervisor opened her mouth as if to speak, but stopped herself because there was nothing left to direct, nothing left to correct. The process had moved beyond her, and everyone in the room could see it. The officers stood completely at ease now, no longer engaged in enforcement, just present their earlier certainty, replaced by quiet observation, because the authority they had followed had been redefined in front of them, and the crowd remained still, not out of curiosity anymore, but because they understood they were witnessing something that rarely happened in public, a system holding itself accountable in real time. And Darius remained where he had always been, at the center, but untouched by the movement around him, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, like someone who had not come here to confront, but to confirm. And the manager turned fully toward him, now no hesitation left in his tone. Mr. Cole, this situation is now under executive handling, and your clearance has been fully restored. He paused briefly, then added, with precision, your boarding priority has been reinstated and your passage will proceed without further delay. And the words could have sounded like resolution, but they did not carry relief, they carried acknowledgment. And Darius looked at him for a moment, then passed him toward the counter, toward the screen, toward the employees who had made their decisions minutes earlier, and he spoke quietly, not to challenge, not to escalate, but to define what this moment actually meant. I was never delayed because of a system error, he said. I was delayed because of a human decision, and the silence that followed was complete, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just clear, because that was the line that separated everything that had happened from everything that would come next, and no one in that terminal could unhear it. No one argued with that statement, not because they agreed immediately, but because it could not be dismissed, the kind of truth that does not demand acceptance, it simply stands there waiting for everyone else to catch up to it. And the manager exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show that he understood the weight of what had just been said, not as a defense, not as a justification, but as a line that could not be crossed again, not here, not after this. And he nodded once more, this time not to the system, not to the process, but to Darius himself, acknowledging the clarity that had just been placed in front of everyone. You are right, he said quietly, and the words did not try to soften anything. They did not attempt to reframe the situation. They simply existed as recognition, and that alone shifted the room further. The supervisor remained still beside the counter, her eyes no longer searching for answers on the screen, because there were none left to find. Everything that needed to be known had already been revealed, and now all that remained was what would follow it. The agent lowered her gaze briefly, then back up again, not in defiance, not in confusion, but in realization, the kind that comes too late to change the moment, but early enough to understand it. And the young employee, who had spoken earlier, stood quietly, her posture more grounded now, as if witnessing this had settled something inside her, not comfort, not relief, but awareness, the kind that changes how you move from that point forward. And behind them, the system interface updated again, not with alerts this time, but with status changes, terminal operations reassigned, supervisory privileges suspended pending review, and the supervisor saw it, her breath catching slightly as the words registered because this was no longer abstract, this was immediate. Her access, her authority, her position, all now under evaluation. And the manager did not look away from the screen as he spoke. The decision has been logged and will be reviewed at the executive level effective immediately. And there was no emphasis, no added tone, because none was needed. The system had already said everything, and the officers shifted subtly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing with a different understanding now of what their role had been in the moment and what it meant moving forward. The crowd had quieted completely, no phones raised now, no whispers, just stillness, because the outcome had moved beyond spectacle into something more final, something that did not need commentary. And Darius turned slightly, his attention moving from the manager to the space around him, the terminal, the counter, the people, the system, all of it unchanged on the surface, yet entirely different in what it now represented, because what had been hidden in assumption was now visible in action. And he took a small step forward, not toward the exit, not toward the gate, but toward the counter, closing the distance that had once been defined by doubt. And he placed his hand lightly on the surface, not claiming it, not challenging it, just present, and he spoke one last time. His voice calm, steady, and clear. You did not fail because you made a mistake, he said. You failed because you trusted the assumption more than the verification, and the silence that followed was not heavy anymore. It was settled because there was nothing left to prove. The moment had already done that for him. No one rushed to respond because there was nothing left to argue. The moment had already closed in on itself, leaving only consequence, and the manager stepped slightly to the side, giving space. Not as a gesture of authority, but as acknowledgement that this was no longer about control, it was about completion. He turned back to the terminal console, entering one final sequence, his movements precise, deliberate, as the system responded with a soft confirmation tone, not sharp, not alarming, just final status updated, executive review, in progress, personnel access restricted, and the supervisor saw it clearly this time not as a line of text, but as a shift in reality. Her badge no longer held the same weight, her position no longer shielded by assumption, and she lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in recognition that the system she trusted to validate her decisions had now documented them. Instead, the agent beside her remained still, her hands resting just above the counter, not touching anything, as if waiting for permission that would not come. And the young employee took a quiet step forward again, her voice soft but steady. I will make sure this does not happen again, she said. Not as a promise to Darius, but as something she needed to say out loud for herself. And Darius looked at her for a moment, his expression unchanged, but his eyes acknowledging the difference between those who defend and those who learn. And he gave a slight nod, not approval, not dismissal, just recognition that she had seen what mattered. And the manager closed the console, turning back toward Darius, his posture fully aligned now with the outcome of the moment. Mr. Cole, your path is clear, he said calmly. Gate 23 is ready for boarding, and your access has been fully restored. And there was no urgency in his tone, no attempt to move things along quickly, because everyone understood that this was not about catching a flight anymore. It was about what had already happened before it. And Darius stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just with the same measured pace he had carried from the beginning, his hand lifting briefly to retrieve his boarding pass from the counter. The same pass that had been questioned minutes ago now returned without resistance. And as he turned slightly toward the gate, the space around him shifted, people moving just enough to create a clear path, not out of obligation, but out of respect, the kind that is not requested but earned in silence. And the officers stepped aside fully now, their presence no longer guiding him out, but allowing him through. And the supervisor remained where she was, her posture still, but changed, her eyes no longer searching for control, because control had never been the answer. And the terminal slowly returned to its rhythm, boarding calls resuming, footsteps echoing, rolling suitcases moving once again. But something in the air had changed. Something quieter, deeper, something that would not reset as easily as the screens behind the counter. And just before Darius crossed into the boarding lane, he paused for a fraction of a second, not turning back, not addressing the room, just speaking forward, his voice low, but clear enough to carry. You did not remove me, he said, you revealed yourselves. And then he continued walking, leaving behind a space that would not forget what had just been exposed. The sound of boarding resumed like nothing had happened, announcements echoing overhead, passengers scanning tickets, stepping forward in steady lines, the rhythm of the terminal rebuilding itself piece by piece. But it was not the same, not really, because something had Shifted beneath it something quieter than noise, but louder than routine, and the people who had witnessed it carried that shift with them even as they moved on. A man who had been recording earlier lowered his phone completely, now not because he lost interest, but because he understood he had just captured something that did not need replay to matter. A woman near the gate adjusted her bag slowly, her eyes still fixed on the counter behind her, as if trying to process how quickly certainty had turned into silence, and the young employee remained where she was, her posture no longer uncertain, but grounded, her attention no longer split between tasks, but focused on something deeper, something that would shape every decision she made from that moment forward, not out of fear, but out of awareness, the kind that does not fade when the moment ends. And behind the counter, the system continued its quiet work, lines of review, status updates, compliance flags, each one moving forward without interruption. Because systems do not forget, once they begin, they complete, and the supervisor stood still, watching the screen, not searching, not reacting, just absorbing the reality that had unfolded around her, not in minutes, but in choices that had seemed small at the time, questions asked with the wrong tone, decisions made without full information, escalations that followed assumption instead of verification, and now all of it connected in a way that could not be separated. The manager remained nearby, not intervening, not directing, just present as the process continued, because there was nothing left to manage. The system had taken over, and it would go where it needed to go. And Darius moved through the boarding lane without pause, his steps steady, his focus forward, not looking back, not checking for reactions, because he did not need to. The moment had already said everything for him. As he reached the gate scanner, the agent there glanced at his boarding pass, then at the system, then back at him, her expression shifting instantly from routine to recognition, not exaggerated, not performative, just precise, like someone who understood exactly what stood in front of her. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Cole," she said clearly, and he nodded once, not acknowledging the words, but the tone, because tone is where everything begins and everything ends. And as he stepped onto the jet bridge, the noise of the terminal softened behind him, fading into something distant, something already past, but not forgotten. Because what had happened there would not stay contained within that space. It would move through reports, through reviews, through conversations that would not sound the same anymore. And somewhere behind him, the system logged its final entry for the incident review, complete findings, pending executive decision, and that line carried forward into everything that would come next, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as correction at the level where it actually matters. And inside the aircraft, as he took his seat, the cabin remained quiet, unaware of the moment that had just unfolded outside, unaware of how close it had come to being something else entirely. And Darius settled in calmly, his expression unchanged, his presence steady like it had been from the beginning, because for him, this was never about proving who he was. It was about revealing how they chose to treat someone they thought he was not. And as the cabin door closed and the aircraft prepared for departure, the truth of that moment remained behind, not as noise, not as memory, but as something far more lasting, a standard that had just been tested and for the first time in a long time had been forced to answer for itself.